Well, I mean, on a very practical level, there are these soil health principles, which is different than thinking just about practices. So, understanding the principles of how a landscape works, and I'm going like this because you can look behind me to see we can take our cues from nature.
Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. I'm Adam Sachs, the Executive Director of Biodiversity for a Livable Climate, and this series, Life Saves the Planet, is a collaboration between us and GBH, and we are excited to present Didi Pershouse and Katharine Zywert. Didi Pershouse is the author of The Ecology of Care: Medicine, Agriculture, Money, and the Quiet Power of Human and Microbial Communities, and also Understanding Soil Health and Watershed Function. She teaches participatory workshops both in person and online, helping to connect the dots between soil health, human health, water, and climate resiliency. She is the founder of the Land and Leadership Initiative and the Center for Sustainable Medicine, and a co-founder of the Can We Rehydrate California initiative. She was one of 5 speakers at the United Nations FAO World Soil Day in 2017, and she also has spoken at a couple of Biodiversity for Livable Climates conferences. Katharine Zywert works at the intersection of social ecological systems change and health. She is a PhD candidate at the University of Waterloo, where her dissertation focuses on the long-term prospects for human health and well-being on a planet in ecological crisis. She is also a strategic implementation lead at Openly, where she supports change makers across diverse fields to shift systems towards greater equity, health, and sustainability. Katharine holds a master's degree in medical anthropology from the University of Oxford and a graduate diploma in social innovation from the University of Waterloo. And so with that, Katharine, I'll turn it over to you.
Excellent. Thanks, Adam. As Adam was saying, my work is about health systems in a time of social and ecological change. And I'm not looking so much at how healthcare needs to become more sustainable, but how practices that exist on the fringes of health systems can help to support living communities across scales to flourish. And so that's how Didi and I became connected a number of years ago. And Didi, I thought we could open up the conversation today by talking about the relationship between soil health and public health and how you understand those two scales to be connected.
Yeah, thanks, and great to be here. So I have been, I started off actually as a healthcare provider and then was writing this book for 9 years, The Ecology of Care, that was looking at ecological models of caring for humans. So how can our healthcare system shift to be what we were then calling more sustainable in those days? But also, how is our own health nested within the health of the living systems around us and also within us? So looking at the microbiome. And while I was writing that book, I live in Vermont, grew up actually in Cambridge. So hello to all my fellow Cantabrigians and Bostonians. But while I was working on that book, we had a huge flood here, Hurricane Irene. And I got that kind of brought together my love of water and water systems and my interest in resiliency, and sparked some intrigue around public health and climate change, so that my book expanded a bit more to include that. Pretty quickly after that, I read the book Cows Save the Planet by Judith Schwartz, who I think was an earlier guest on this forum, and decided to shift my attention towards soil health and regenerative agriculture, because I saw that it was a much easier way to change public health than continuing to see patients a few at a time. So I had already been thinking a lot about how what people eat impacts their health, both in terms of nutrient density, traditional foods, avoiding pesticides, and keeping blood sugar levels stable and all of that. But I started to understand while traveling around the country and visiting a bunch of regenerative farms and ranches how the soil itself really I'm talking about the soil system, which includes the plants, grazing animals, insects, soil microbes, mycorrhizal fungi and saprophytic fungi, and all the interesting things that are happening in a soil system actually all contribute to public health through a whole bunch of ways. And I started trying to figure out, how am I going to explain this, and what's the low-hanging fruit here in terms of making change? And I wrote a grant to start developing curriculum called Understanding Soil Health and Watershed Function. And while developing that curriculum, which I did both in high school classrooms in several parts of the country, as well as working with farmers and ranchers at conferences to understand what are the key ways that we can get people to be able to see the living systems around them. While doing that, I came up with this now sort of famous bread and flour demonstration, which is being used all over the world. And I will share my screen so we can do this. This is the curriculum itself, which you can download, and it's great for people of all ages. A lot of people in 60 different countries are using it for adult education. You can download it right there at www.landandleadership.org. But I want to, before we get into this bread and flour demo, Catherine, I thought maybe you and I could list off what are our big concerns these days in terms of public health, climate change, the intersection of those. So I know that for me, one of the big ones that I experienced early on was flooding, and then the flip side of that, which is actually part of the same problem, is drought. How about on your end? What are some of the things that you're?
Yeah, I would say that right now we're very concerned about infectious disease, the risk of infectious disease, and how this may be driven by changes in land use around the world. I think I'm also very concerned about overconsumption of resources and energy.
Mm-hmm.
And I know that this links back as well. So those would be some of my top concerns.
Yeah, and at the other end of our continent, there's we're having these huge wildfires, and also in the middle of the country, which also relates to soil health and watershed function, as we'll see. People are worried about rising oceans, about forced migration, algae blooms, which are a huge public health issue, dropping water tables, which concentrate toxins in the water in places that are experiencing drought. So all of that's going on, and more. So what we typically do is to divide everything up into little academic departments and budgetary lines, and put a little bit of money here, a little bit of money there, etc. But is there a way that we can address this? Is there one nodal intervention, as Carol Sanford would say, where we can get at all of it? And I think that's what I call the soil sponge. So this is a little video to show we're gonna think about the sand, silt, and clay that is just basically the broken down rocks that make up a landscape, is what soil goes back to when it gets degraded. And it gets degraded from not having living plants growing on it, from too much tillage, from not having enough diversity in the system, from being left bare out in the hot sun, from biocides being sprayed over the land in the form of pesticides, etc. So when soil reverts back to just the mineral particles, and it doesn't have any life in it, it acts a little bit like just flour. So we're gonna see what happens if we rain on these bare mineral particles. Okay, so I do this demo, poke some holes in a cup, and let's start raining. So what do you see, Catherine?
I can see that nothing is holding those particles together. They are running off.
Yeah.
You can see a lot of water collecting at the edge of the plate.
Yep. So we're seeing erosion, we're seeing runoff, which in an actual landscape would be creating flooding. Nothing's getting down to the plant roots under there. Anyone who's done any baking knows that water is just sitting on the top. And we're also seeing a lot of stuff getting into the water. So if there were pesticides being used on that landscape, those are now in the water system. What we didn't do in this little video is, before you put the water on there, if a big wind came along, that soil is also now in the air and bringing with it any of the chemicals that are being used, anything that has been spread across the land due to wildfire, for example, which is huge amounts of toxic substances. If you're near a feedlot, you are now inhaling antibiotic resistant bacteria in the air as that soil blows away. So that structural integrity isn't there, and that means that whatever's in the land is now in our water and in our air. So how do you turn flour into bread? What do you need to add besides liquid? Biology,
yeast.
right? Yeast. So yeah, so basically microbes. Yep. And so with soil, it's not just yeast, it's all kinds of living things. But when we add biology to a landscape, suddenly all of those individual particles become something like a sponge or like bread. They're now stuck together with these biological slimes and glues, like that act kind of like egg white. And then the threads of plant root hairs and fungal hyphae move through there and tie those little aggregates together. And then life starts moving through, earthworms and little amoebae and little things that move through the soil and create passageways. And suddenly you have something that's fluffy and porous to accept water, but that also has structural integrity. So like a kitchen sponge isn't a sponge if it falls apart when you put it in water, right? Or it wouldn't be a sponge if when you blew on it, it fell apart and turned into dust. So a soil sponge has to have that porosity as well as the structural integrity. And what happens when we rain on the soil sponge? So pretty different. The rain's coming down, it's soaking in, it's going down where the plant roots can get it. We're not seeing any erosion, we're not seeing mudslides, we're not seeing flooding. We're protecting that water from evaporation. So we're going to have a lot less drought. Flooding and drought are actually two sides of the same thing. As that water runs off, it's not there for the plants. So, but it is there in the rivers for short flash floods. And then you can see now that as the water sinks in, it starts to move sideways and refill the rivers, the ponds, waterways, etc. But from springs underground, it's refilling the aquifers, it's refilling our wells. And it's being cleaned both physically by moving through this kind of carbon filter, but also biologically, the biology in there is helping to break down anything in there that is not good for us. So we're getting not only more water, but we're getting cleaner water. Of course, in a landscape like this, the green growing season, if you live in a warmer, drier climate, is going to get extended dramatically. So you're also going to get more cooling from transpiration. So we can cool regional climates, and some people feel that we can actually cool our global climate if we could have 25% longer or more green growth on our bare agricultural lands, that would be enough to offset the 0.6 degrees warming that we've had already. But we're also growing more food for everybody. We're having more water for everybody. So forced migration, are people needing to leave the land to go find another place? Are people fighting over scant resources? Much less of that. Fewer refugee camps where things can spread. Less poverty, less food insecurity, less water insecurity, fewer toxins in the water and in the air. This is all public health. When we have fewer floods, that's also less mold, less of those public health issues that go along with that. Cooler temperatures, as more less of the heat issues that we see with elderly people. And big one, as we were talking about the wildfires, when you have this cool, moist, spongy landscape, if a tree falls over there, as we know in New England, most of the time our forests operate like this. If a tree falls over, the saprophytic fungi are going to decompose that tree and break it down and turn it back into soil. Whereas if you have a dry, dusty landscape, a tree is going to just be there until it gets oxidized by the sunlight, which could be hundreds and hundreds of years after it dies. So, so a lot less chance for wildfires to get going and develop. Well, we can get into the nutrient density of food. That's a whole other topic, but I'll just say briefly, when you have that much life in the soil, so what's happening with that life is it's all going out and bringing back nutrients for the plants. And as all of that life eats each other in the soil, each time that something is eating and pooping something out, that's nutrients that are now available to plants, making the fertilizer use irrelevant. So the amount of nutrients in our food also rises really dramatically when we have a functioning soil sponge. We can look at that, we can show more of that later, but I want to kind of jump back in and see where we want to go next.
Yeah, Didi, I think one of my favorite things about your work is how you have identified this single leverage point that accomplishes so much. If we build back the soil sponge, we're addressing health, not just at the level of course, the soil ecology itself, but of planetary systems and the way that they function, and human community health outcomes, and the opportunities that are available to human communities in the places in which they live. And so I think, given the insights about how we can transform health across scales with this one leverage point, how do you think that we can start shifting the way that we actually structure systems in the world so that we begin to make this a reality? How do we instantiate this in the world?
Yeah, well, I mean, on a very practical level, there are these soil health principles, which is different than thinking just about practices. So understanding the principles of how a landscape works, and I'm going like this because you can look behind me to see we can take our cues from nature. So first of all, nature doesn't grow monocrops, right? We always have diversity. We have diversity both of the plant life, but also of the microbial life and the insect life, etc. And that's a diverse food web that's just in the same way that if you and I ate nothing but carrots, no matter how good carrots are for us, we'd get sick over time, right? So if we just grow corn and soy on a landscape, you can't sustain a diverse community underground without diverse plants above ground. So diversity is one of the principles for growing the soil sponge, or for having healthier soil or more living soil and living landscapes. Because every plant that's on there is both feeding above ground life and below ground life. And we tend to think only about it feeding humans, but it has to feed all of the essential workers in the landscape. And that includes every species. So, so if you're only feeding humans, or you're only feeding cows, or you're only growing biofuels, you're not going to sustain a civilization. And we've seen civilizations fall pretty quickly because of that. The other thing is that there's very little bare soil in a natural landscape. Maybe, where somebody dug some, a squirrel came along and dug a hole, and it's bare for a few weeks, and then, the grass grows in, or something sprouts there. So keeping soil covered is one of the really simple things that communities and farmers can start to do. And preferably you want to keep it covered with living plants as much as possible, but not all seasonal climates can do that. So even if you are even if you have to take the crop off, for example, then you want to leave some of the crop litter or the dead plants there. Preferably you want to cut it so that the roots are still in the ground without tilling the soil. And we used to think, oh, well, let's leave the soil bare and fallow it to let it rest. But what you're actually doing is starving it if you don't have anything there. So when there's dead plants there, they're feeding the decomposers and the chewers and the shredders. And when there are live plants there, it's kickstarting the whole rest of the food web. So starting with bacteria and fungi, the mycorrhizal fungi. So you really want both happening. Those are the big soil health principles: is living roots in the ground for as long as possible, keeping the soil covered in one way or another, so not letting the soil be bare, so with dead or living plants, having diversity, minimizing disturbance and tillage, and then integrating animals, allowing animals to be part of the system. So whether that, at a very minimum, that means bringing in manure into a farm of some sort, including us rethinking our own systems to include human manure, which many countries have done for many years, and can be done very safely. There's a great quote about, whoever thought of us, taking our waste and putting it directly into our water system? Like, whose idea was that to integrate those two? When we put it into the ground, it instantly goes to good use. So so those are some of the simple principles that we can use. Some of the things people can think about just in their own property is letting your lawn grow much longer before you cut it, and also raising the blade so that when you do cut it, there's a lot more plant left to photosynthesize and transpire and cool and break the rainfall from hitting the ground so hard. And making sure that parks and open spaces have green growth there all, as much of the year as possible. Green rooftops, all of this, anywhere that we can have green. But on a farm scale, which is really where we need to get to, is making sure that we have diverse cover crops. That's absolute first priority.
So I know that those kinds of soil health principles, when you talk about them, they sound intuitive, but they're actually very different from the way that conventional farming works.
Oh yeah.
And so given that you have worked quite a lot with leaders in the soil health movement and in the regenerative agriculture movement, what do you think people need in order to be successful? I know that you also have experience doing peer facilitation and counseling. Could you speak to how networks of support can help to deepen those types of movements and help these practices to take root?
Yeah, well, one of the most exciting projects that I've been involved in since I got involved in this is working with the Farmer Field School program of the UN in Andhra Pradesh, India. And I was there last November helping to develop training materials for them, kind of a spin-off of the manual, the Understanding Soil Health and Watershed Function manual. And this is a state in southeastern India, pretty large agricultural state that was experiencing what everywhere in the world is experiencing, but on a pretty intense way, of a lot of public health issues from pesticides, a lot of failures of the water system, water tables and wells dropping, 10, 20, 30 feet over just a few years, huge farmer suicide rates, which is true all over the world, that farmers and ranchers have a much higher rate of suicide. In India and elsewhere, but in India, there was a very particular tie to them being lent money or sold into a project of growing conventional crops using conventional practices in let's say industrial crops and industrial practices, being told that it was going to bring them more money, and then the crops failing because they're not appropriate for what's going on there in terms of their land, and then being deep in debt and drinking the pesticides as a way to kill themselves because of the shame and humiliation and just despair. So this is sort of the backdrop of this program that started just a few years ago, of doing something called natural farming or zero budget natural farming or community-based natural farming. There's a few different names for the project depending on when you look into it or got involved with it. And they started doing types of farming that were using no inputs that weren't from the village itself. So you couldn't bring in, not couldn't, they were encouraging farmers to experiment with this. So there's no hard and fast rules, but to take a part of their farm and experiment with no fertilizers other than those that you could make from cow dung, cow urine, plants, herbs, microbes, forest soils, etc. No insecticides other than those made from herbs, like traditional Indian herbs that like neem, that help to ward off pests and viruses, etc. And using cover crops, and more recently, based on work actually from our conference here in Vermont, our soil sponge conference, they started doing pre-monsoon dry sowing, which means planting crops before the rains come, with the understanding that as you build a soil sponge, you can actually have more water in the system before the rain, and that also understanding that the plants themselves can capture atmospheric humidity and water that's in the air through like dew and condensation, and they're getting a full crop ahead of time through this. So your question was about support groups, and where that comes in is that and I wanted to say there are 750,000 farmers in this state. Currently, 1 out of every 8 farmers that's involved in this project. And now other states in India and Rwanda and other countries are all wanting to learn this and turn their whole state into these green, diverse, natural farming states. So it's super exciting. Now, how, like, this is what we dream about, is some project like this. How did they get that many people involved? Well, 20 something years ago, the same person who's kind of helping to manage in this project had helped to start women's self-help economic groups all across India. I think there are 20 million women involved in these. And this is in every village. There are women, particularly poor women, but women from a variety of castes and backgrounds, different religions, meeting together in small groups. Primarily, it started off to help each other with projects and pool their resources, so that if somebody's car broke down, or somebody's child was ready to go to college and there were no funds, somebody's house burned down, somebody lost a crop, that there were funds available, which they leveraged with banks, because they now had more money when they pooled their resources to lend to each other. but then they took on all these other things. They realized that by, we have a visitor, some visitors here to the webinar. They started taking on things like domestic violence and drug addiction and child marriages, etc. So when Vijay Kumar, the person who had helped to set up these women's self-help groups, learned about regenerative agriculture, he, oh, we're having a party now. He thought, who better to roll this program out than these incredible women who already have 20 years worth of relationships, and many, many, many of whom were already farmers. So a lot of the farmers in India are women. So they took it up. I think the initial thing was around public health, around cleaner water, better food for their children, cleaner air, fewer pesticides, addressing the suicide issue. But now they're really interested in like learning all the other stuff that's going on with it. So that's an example of how these kind of peer support networks can be a great foundation for change. It's kind of like the soil sponge of the human aspect, right? It's these connections and this structural integrity and this ability to absorb and infiltrate and spread and move things, and to move resources from one place to another within this living matrix. But we have similar things going on here in the States and in Canada. Some of the first ranchers that I met were doing holistic management in southeastern Saskatchewan. And for those who understand soil carbon, those were the people who we found the highest soil carbon levels of anyone that we were monitoring while we were going across the continent and monitoring. And they had been meeting for 17 years in these support groups to talk about what they were learning, what their failures were, to deal with the coffee shop moment where you walk into a coffee shop in a small community and everybody's shaking their heads and going, oh, those people don't know what they're doing. They're just growing weeds. They're ruining everything. Because you get a lot of social pushback when you change from the way farming is supposed to look. So they would, the first thing on their agenda was not, what conference did you go to last week, but is anyone having a really hard time with something? And that could be a marriage issue. It could be the cows were out and we need to get in our trucks and go round them up. It could be somebody's, loan came due and they didn't have enough. Whatever it is, that's what they would deal with first. So it became a very tight-knit group. And when you have a group like that, you have a place you can fail, you can experiment and take that risk, knowing that you're not going to have to deal with it by yourself. And you have a place where you can celebrate your successes, which is one of the things I've noticed is maybe even harder than talking about failures for a lot of the Midwestern farmers that I've met. They're happy to talk about what went wrong, but it's very countercultural to celebrate, like, wow, I just doubled my income. So
yeah, I think I love that analogy, how the sort of social networks really mirror the networks within the soil. I think that's so appropriate. And I think I'm interested to know what you see happening in this current moment. There are a lot of change makers from across many different fields and who are doing things related to health and equity and sustainability and ecological change, who see the pandemic and the process of rebuilding from the pandemic as a window of opportunity to sort of nudge our entire social and ecological system in a more positive direction. Do you think that that is true? And what would you recommend that people do in this moment in order to try to make the more benevolent possibilities more likely?
Well, one of the things that we've seen around here is in Vermont, we already had a decent local food network. And those local food networks, because they were already connected, and this kind of goes back to the support group idea, they were able to really shift very quickly to food distribution, to making sure that people who didn't have a lot of money got food, to filling up the food banks, and just figuring out creative ways to get food from place to place, while the supermarkets were floundering and the shelves were empty. And I think from what I hear from friends in Ontario and other places, I think this has been happening in many parts of the world, that suddenly those people who had already built local food networks were in much better shape than people who were living in food deserts, which is usually not of one's own volition. That's often a socioeconomic and social justice issue as well. So that's one key piece, is just food availability, right? But the other thing is that when we're facing something like a pandemic, our immunity, our baseline health, suddenly it's like, whoa, this is not like, am I healthy? Do I need to lose a little weight, or do I, the sort of usual health worries. This is like, suddenly becomes more of a life and death issue. And this, where I put back on my healthcare provider hat that I had on for 25 years, and start saying, there are ways that you can eat that will really, really give your system a fighting chance, or better, you can be really thriving rather than just surviving. And it kind of goes back to that soil health, because where do we find foods that are grown that way? It's hard to find vegetables that are grown that way. You're lucky if you can. I mean, that's there are some vegetable farmers that are starting to figure it out. There's a few grain farmers that are starting to figure it out. But right now, you can go out and buy grass-fed beef, that those beef, or grass-fed dairy, or true pasture-raised organic eggs, butter, any of those animal products, that those are eating a diverse diet from land that has not been disturbed, that has a diversity of plants growing in it, that has a space for pollinators and other insects to participate, and where you're getting the benefit of having those underground relationships bringing nutrients at the right time to the plants. So those mycorrhizal fungi are and they are like a little information system under the ground that can say, hey, there's a virus coming. It's down the road. And if you start making these particular volatile organic compounds, or these particular secondary metabolites, you will be protected from it. So the plants are actually sensing what's in the environment, changing their chemistry within hours sometimes based on this information. And then the animals are eating those plants, and that's changing their whole profile, their whole metabolism, their whole immune system. So that's one place. But let's say that you're a vegetarian or a vegan, then you can also eat foods that are grown in perennial systems. So that's where we think of like a lot of these things that we think of as superfoods, blueberries and nuts and things like that are avocados that are grown on trees or bushes. So you're not tilling the soil every year. Why are they superfoods? Because those plants have a chance to develop those underground relationships. So nuts are a little tricky because they are also and avocados are, there are some social justice and environmental justice issues associated with a lot of those superfoods. So that's also a bit of a quandary in terms of, are you actually protecting diversity when you eat those foods, or are you just improving your own health? So so those are some things, if you're lucky enough to live somewhere or privileged enough to live somewhere where there's a lot of open land around you, eating wild foods is also an option. So that's great, because then those are long-term relationships that have developed in the land that you are benefiting from.
Mhm.
So, and I'll just say, I know we were going to touch on, I see we're running low on time here, but on this kind of sterile versus fertile model of care. And
Yes.
uh, in the Ecology of Care in the book, that's one of the basic frameworks that I use to look at different systems. And I'm making the point that we've developed a way of living in the world of farming and of medicine where we're trying to always kill off or get rid of whatever's in our way. And that's whether we're talking about pesticides or antibiotics or indigenous people or people with disabilities, or it's rampant through our entire society. A fertile model of care is really collaborating with all of life and figuring out what's your place within a nested whole. What are the multiple enfolded relationships that go all the way from your microbiome all the way to the microbiome of the soil. So that's just a quick glance at that piece.
Yeah, that's great. And it reminds me, one of the studies that, or the case examples that I'm using in my research is care farming from the Netherlands. And in that context, it's people with often long-term disabilities, or other vulnerabilities, addictions, mental health issues. And the whole premise of this model is that these people are invited onto farms in order to just work on the farm and do what needs to be done. And it improves health across scales because people are engaging in meaningful work. They improve their physical health by doing handwork and being on the land, as well as getting all of the social benefits of being part of a network of all the people who are on the farm. And then this also improves the local ecology because the farmers are able to be using more handwork to do their farming, so they can use organic methods much more easily. So I think that is very much in line with the kind of fertile model of care that you're talking about.
Yeah, absolutely.
I
So
think it's about time to open up our conversation into the Q&A. So I think some questions are going to come my way.
Well, Katharine, we do have a number of questions, and I would like to kind of segue from Didi's mention of her book, Ecology of Care, and mention that I read it when it first came out. I was actually the second person to post a comment about it on the place that must not be mentioned. And it's a wonderful book. It's full of compassion and insight and humor, and I highly recommend it. So on that note, one of the questions that came through from an attendee was, where can I buy a copy of your book other than the one that starts with A, ends with N, and has a Z somewhere in the middle?
So unfortunately, as someone who is a self-published author, at the time when I published it, the best way to do that was to have it be printed on demand through CreateSpace, which is part of Amazon. So it remains not only available on Amazon, but printed by them. So even if you were to buy it directly from me or from your bookstore, it's still sadly coming through them. It is also available on Kindle. I am about to start publishing chapters from it on Medium. So if you are patient and want to read parts of it at a time, and some of them will be actually updated a little bit because it came out 4 years ago, you will be seeing chapters appearing on my Medium page. Yeah, that's the long and the short of it. And if you were interested in buying directly from me, I don't recommend doing that with single copies. because that's a lot more circles around through the postal system. But I can, if you have an organization or a group that wants to buy in bulk, that's something that is worth contacting me about. Okay.
Okay, Catherine, are you going to continue with the questions?
Yes, and I think we'll start with one about California. So Didi, how would you recommend rehydrating California? Is that possible? Where would you start?
Yeah, and you know, we use the term, this is a term that came up in our annual soil sponge conference that Walter Jena and I put on, where he suggested that we orient our future work around an audacious goal in the form of a question, such as, can we rehydrate California? So the next year when we came back, we went on this massive speaking tour together, including, I think, 8 events in California called Can We Rehydrate California? So, but it's just as relevant to any other state or country that is experiencing wildfires and dropping water tables, etc. So you probably know, in some ways, my answer is regenerate the soil sponge. But looking at California is a really interesting example because the California's Central Valley, which is where I think like 40% of our fruits and vegetables and nuts are grown for the US, used to be basically an entire huge, beautiful valley of wetlands. And those wetlands would create cooling that would then pull moist air up over from the coast up over the coastal range into the valley. The vegetation there would condense all of that moist air and turn it into rain clouds and then into drops of rain heavy enough to fall. Some of that moisture would then go up over the Sierras, and the trees on the coastal range in the Sierras would harvest that fog and that moisture from the air, which then would help to water them, but also create more water coming down through the sponge and refilling the valley. So what did we do? We killed off beavers throughout the West Coast as part of a kind of a land claim, which Ben Goldfarb's book Eager is an amazing documentation of that, as is a book called Water by Alice Outwater, Water, A Natural History. And cut down, you know, everything that was growing there, tilled up the soil sponge. So basically put that bread in a blender and then, and then started pumping water out of the aquifer, sending it off into the ocean, like not recollecting it anywhere. So when it does rain, everything goes into an aqueduct and is taken off the land as fast as possible. So there are numerous organizations that are thinking about this in some creative ways. One is really rethinking whether it's even legal to have bare soil. So I personally, when I drive through the Central Valley and see just mile upon mile of bare soil, whether it's between crops or whether it's under fruit trees, fruit and nut trees, it just makes my skin crawl. And you can smell in the air the anaerobic state that soil is in, from compaction, from being bare, having nothing really living that is the kind of life that's supposed to be there. So it starts smelling sort of sludgy and sewagey. So easy low-hanging fruit, make cover crops required on all farms, which would help to kickstart that cooling and that sucking moist air in, and it would also help to capture more rain and start refilling those aquifers. It's counterintuitive in a state where you are having water shortages to have cover crops, because it's like, but they take water. But yes, they may take water, especially the first 1 or 2 years, to kind of get them established. But as soon as that sponge gets established, and anytime that the sun is out, those cover crops are actually protecting the water that's already in the soil. So that's one one big one. The other one is changing the grazing patterns, and using holistic decision making as a way to manage grazing lands, where you're really looking and watching, constantly adapting where the cattle are based on, does it need more rest? Does it need grazing now to reduce fire risk? Does it need, what is, and that means learning to read the land. So those are two easy ones. No-till is huge and wonderful, but often goes along with a lot of herbicide use unless people are being creative. So yes, I would love it if everything was no-till organic, but that's kind of the gold standard right now that people are figuring out. Green Cover Seed is having a webinar series that includes one about no-till organic that I'm really interested. It's coming up pretty soon. That's I think they are in Nebraska, if you look up Green Cover Seed.
Great. And if you,
one other thing is that like anytime where you can put in little dams, or stop shunting the water off to the ocean. So Michael Kravchuk's work is all about slowing the water and letting it seep in, which is a little different than rebuilding the sponge, but they kind of go together. So that's the other piece, is figuring out how to not just get rid of water whenever it rains.
mm-hmm.
Yeah. Okay.
So I think what you've said has maybe gone a little ways to answer the next couple of questions, and I'll ask two of them together. So the first is, what policies would promote soil health at the municipal level? And then also, what role do large institutions have to play?
Yeah, well, I think at the municipal level, I saw these questions ahead of time and spent the afternoon thinking about this. So thanks there were some great questions that people sent in. There are some cities that have started taxing people at a higher level if they have pavement in their yard, or if they have bare soil in their yard. So actually having tax breaks for any kind of impermeable surface. I mean, sorry, the other way around. So tax breaks for having less impermeable surface, or and taxing higher when someone has more pavement or roof that's not a green roof, or driveway that's paved over, or just a backyard that's just bare. Another one is actually, a lot of places have rules about that you have to mow your lawn. So shifting those rules to saying that your lawn can't be below a certain height if you have a lawn. And that you can't mow your lawn more often than X amount of times per summer, which would push people into thinking about different kinds of grasses that they might grow that have deeper root systems but less on top, so that grow a little bit more slowly, that actually start creating that sponge, that have more diversity, or changing their yard into a garden. Though grass is not the worst thing in the world if it's managed well. I mean, grasses can grow a beautiful sponge, but not the way we manage grass. And lawns, I don't know, Adam probably knows how many, the amount of lawns versus versus farmland. It's crazy how much of our open land is in lawns, and what we could do with that if they were managed better. I'm also a big proponent of community gardens for all sorts of reasons, including some of the stuff you were saying about the just overall benefits that people see when people from all walks of life get involved in growing their own food. It's huge and important. So and then community composting is another one that's catching on, but that's also a big deal, is to take food waste and yard waste and compost it and then return it to the parks and the baseball fields and people's backyards, etc. Because that's if it's composted well, which I'm a big proponent of Elaine Ingham's work with the Soil Food Web School. That can make a huge difference in activating the soil biology. when you put it back on the land.
Wonderful. And shifting scales a little bit, what can individuals do? If you were going to recommend just a couple of actions that people can take, especially now in the pandemic when folks are in their homes more and perhaps have a little bit more time to devote to these kinds of actions, what would you recommend that people do?
So supporting local farmers is a big deal, especially farmers who are trying to do the right thing and shift towards organic, etc. And really, in terms of your own health and your own microbiome, which we didn't get much into, but your microbiome is very much like the soil microbiome. Eating a wide diversity of foods, trying to avoid any pesticides in your food as much as you can, which is not easy on a limited budget, but will get easier as the more of us who do it. And that's particularly true for animal-based foods, because animals are collecting those pesticides and moving them up the food chain. So if there's this much on an ear of corn, a cow that's eaten more of that is going to have that much more. So and then what I said about mowing your lawn higher or turning your yard into a food production space, including getting some chickens. I'm a big advocate for chickens, who are great composters if you want to compost your own food. Those are all some of those low hanging easy things that we can do.
Well, Didi and Katharine, thank you so much for a most enlightening and just really interesting discussion of what's going on around the world in all of these issues. We really appreciate how GBH is moving forward with Life Saves the Planet, and I think Didi has illustrated to a great extent how it is living systems that are going to save the planet. There's no high-tech machinery that can outwit 4 billion years of evolution. So on that note, thank you very much for joining us today.